The silence was the first thing she had sought, and the last thing she had come to fear. It lived in the vast, empty spaces between the towering pines that guarded her mountain cabin, in the crisp, cold air that held no echo of human life. For Alara, this silence had once been a balm, a thick, protective layer over the raw wound of a life she had fled. Now, it was beginning to feel like a shroud. She stood before her easel, brush poised, but her eyes weren't on the canvas. They were fixed on the window, watching the world dissolve into a maelstrom of white. The snow had started that morning as a gentle dusting, a picturesque postcard scene, but the mountain had its own rules. By midday, the gentle flakes had morphed into a furious, horizontal assault, driven by a wind that shrieked like a vengeful spirit through the eaves of her small, sturdy home. Her cabin, once a sanctuary, was rapidly becoming a cage. 3 years. It had been 3 years since she'd traded the cacophony of the city for this self-imposed exile. 3 years since the betrayal that had felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and the color from her world. She had been a painter on the verge of acclaim, her work celebrated for its vibrant, emotional intensity. Then came the scandal: a mentor, a trusted friend, who had stolen her work, claimed it as his own, and then systematically dismantled her reputation when she dared to fight back. The critics, once her champions, turned on her with savage glee. The whispers in crowded galleries became accusations. Her name forever tied to plagiarism and instability, so she had run. She'd found the most remote place she could afford, a place where the only whispers were the wind in the trees and the only judgment came from the stoic. Silent Peaks. Here, her art had changed. The vibrant colors vanished, replaced by a palette of charcoal, gray, and stark white. She painted the skeletal branches of winter trees, the sharp, unforgiving angles of rock faces, the endless expanse of a lonely sky. She painted her own isolation, trapping it on canvas so it couldn't consume her entirely. A violent gust of wind rattled the window pane, jolting her back to the present. The power, which had been flickering for the last hour, finally gave up with a definitive click, plunging the cabin into a dim, gray twilight. The hum of the refrigerator died, leaving a silence that was deeper, more absolute. It was the silence of being completely and utterly cut off. Alara sighed, a small puff of white in the chilling air. She was prepared. Of course, her pantry was stocked, her woodpile was high, and the great stone fireplace in the center of the room was her reliable hearth. She moved with a practiced, unhurried rhythm, lighting the kerosene lamps she kept ready for such occasions. Their warm, golden glow pushed back the encroaching shadows, casting flickering light on the canvases stacked against the walls, a gallery of ghosts, a testament to her solitude. But preparedness was a practical matter. It couldn't quiet the mind as she coaxed a fire to life. The crackle of the kindling was the only sound to challenge the storm's fury. In the void, the memories she worked so hard to suppress began to stir. The ghost of laughter in a shared studio, the scent of turpentine and wine, the sickening, hollow feeling of seeing her soul laid bare on a gallery wall with another's name signed in the corner. She shook her head, physically trying to dislodge the thoughts. She would not let the storm win. She would not let the past win. But as the hours bled into one another and the snow continued to fall, the cabin felt smaller, the walls closer. The wind no longer sounded like a spirit. It sounded like a predator, circling, testing the defenses of her small fortress. Every creak of the wood, every shudder of the roof under the growing weight of the snow, amplified her vulnerability. This was different from her chosen solitude. That had been an act of control, a deliberate turning away from a world that had hurt her. This was a forced imprisonment by a power far greater than herself. The silence she had curated as a shield was now being wielded as a weapon by the storm, pressing in on her, magnifying the emptiness that clawed at the edges of her sanity. She wrapped a thick quilt around her shoulders and sat in the old armchair by the fire, watching the flames dance. Outside, the world had ceased to exist. There were no paths, no trees, no mountains, only the swirling, hypnotic chaos of the blizzard. For the first time in 3 years, Alara felt a tremor of true fear. It wasn't a fear of the storm itself, but of the profound, crushing loneliness it had so starkly illuminated. She was a tiny, insignificant speck in an indifferent universe. And if she vanished into the white, no one would ever know. The silence would simply swallow her whole. It was a sound so faint. Alara at first dismissed it as a phantom. A high, thin note threaded through the deep baritone of the gale, like a single silver string stretched to its breaking point. She tilted her head, listening past the fire's crackle. There it was again, a desperate pulsing cry that was undeniably organic. It was the sound of life, and it was the sound of suffering. Her logical mind, the one that had engineered her solitary survival for 3 years, immediately supplied a dozen reasons why the sound was an illusion. A trick of the wind whistling through a crack in the foundation, a branch scraping against the roof in a peculiar rhythm. Her own mind, starved of stimulus, simply inventing ghosts in the storm. To even consider the alternative was madness. Going outside in this blizzard, with visibility near zero and the temperature plummeting, was not just foolish, it was a death sentence. A death. She pulled the quilt tighter, turning her gaze back to the hypnotizing flames. Ignore it. It's not your concern. Survival is your only concern. The mantra that had governed her life for so long felt hollow, brittle. The cry came again, sharper this time, punctuated by a brief silence that felt even more harrowing. It was a plea, a desperate, final appeal to a world that couldn't hear it. Something inside Alara, a core of empathy she believed had long since turned to scar tissue, fractured. The image of a small, trapped animal, freezing and alone in the unforgiving white, flashed through her mind. It was a mirror of her own soul, and the reflection was unbearable in that moment. The carefully constructed walls of her apathy crumbled into dust. She stood up, her movements sudden and decisive. Logic was a luxury she could no longer afford. There was no debate, no weighing of risks. There was only the sound and the primal, unthinking need to answer it. Pulling on her heaviest winter gear was like preparing for a battle. Thick thermal layers, waterproof trousers, an insulated parka, snow goggles, and gloves so thick they made her fingers clumsy. As she opened the cabin door, the storm lunged at her. The wind tore the air from her lungs and blasted her face with ice crystals that felt like 1,000 tiny needles. The world beyond her doorstep was a roaring, formless void of white for a terrifying second. She faltered. This was suicide. But then, carried on a vicious gust of wind. She heard the cry one more time. It was weaker now. A fading ember of a sound. Now or never. She tethered a rope to the sturdy iron post of her porch and tied the other end around her waist, a lifeline to find her way back. Then, she plunged into the blizzard. The cold was a physical blow, so intense it felt hot. Every step was a monumental effort, her boots sinking deep into the rapidly accumulating snow. The wind howled in her ears, a deafening roar that erased all other senses. Her goggles were little help against the blinding, swirling chaos. She was moving on pure instinct, heading in the general direction of the sound, toward the ancient, gnarled oak tree that stood as a lone sentinel about 50 yards from her cabin. She felt more than saw the colossal trunk of the old tree, bumping into it with a jarring thud. It was her anchor in the maelstrom. She clung to its rough bark, gasping for breath, her lungs burning. The sound was gone now, lost to the storm or perhaps silenced forever. A wave of despair washed over her. She was too late, but she had come this far. She knelt, her gloved hands sweeping frantically at the base of the tree. Searching through the deep drift that had formed against its windward side, her fingers met something that wasn't frozen earth or hard wood. It was soft, and it was warm. Barely, frantically, she dug away the snow. There, in a small, shallow burrow, were two tiny forms, curled into each other in a desperate, final embrace. Puppies. One was a dark charcoal, the other a patchwork of gray and silver. Their fur was caked with ice, their small bodies trembling violently. One of them, the darker one, managed to lift its head and let out the faintest whimper. Its eyes barely slitted open. It was the sound she had heard. A fierce, protective instinct erupted in Alara with the force of a volcano. It was a feeling so powerful and raw it nearly brought her to her knees. This was not the detached pity one feels for a suffering creature. This was a profound, soul-deep connection. Her own survival. The cold. The storm, it all vanished. The only thing that mattered in the universe was the fragile, fading warmth of the two lives in her hands. Unzipping her parka, she carefully scooped them up, cradling them against the warmth of her own body. They were impossibly small, their tiny hearts beating a frantic, weak rhythm against her chest. She zipped the coat back up, cocooning them in a pocket of life-saving heat. The journey back was a blur of grim determination. She pulled on the rope, her lifeline, and fought her way back through the blizzard, one agonizing step at a time, shielding the precious cargo she carried with her entire being. When she finally stumbled back through her doorway and slammed it shut against the storm, the sudden silence of the cabin was deafening. She collapsed to her knees, her body shaking from cold and exertion, with trembling fingers. She unzipped her parka. The two puppies lay nestled in the warmth, their shivering beginning to subside. They were alive. Alara knelt on the floor in the firelight, carefully toweling them dry with her softest cloths. The world outside could rage on. The ghosts of her past could wait in the shadows. For the first time in 3 long years, the silence in her cabin was not empty. It was filled with the gentle, rhythmic breathing of 2 tiny sparks she had pulled back from the storm. And in saving them, she had the distinct feeling she had just saved herself. The storm raged for another day and a half, sealing Alara and her 2 tiny charges in their cocoon of warmth and firelight. In that time, a forgotten part of her reawakened. The cabin, once a monument to solitude, became a nursery. She spent hours carefully feeding the puppies warm, diluted milk from an eyedropper, her artist's steady hand perfect for the delicate task. She cleaned their fur with a damp, warm cloth, watching as the unique patterns emerged more clearly as they dried. She named them without even thinking about it. The male, whose coat was the color of a stormy sky. She called Kyle. He was the bolder of the two, the first to nuzzle into her hand, his gaze direct and unnervingly intelligent. The female, whose fur was a soft, silvery gray swirled with darker markings like intricate scrollwork. She named Lyra. She was more watchful, her head tilting as if she were listening to something Alara couldn't hear. But her trust, once given, was absolute. It was their eyes that captivated her the most. They weren't the simple blue or brown of a typical puppy. They were a startling shade of pale silver, seeming to catch and reflect the firelight with an inner luminosity. When they looked at her, it didn't feel like the vacant stare of an animal. It felt like a genuine, piercing regard. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world of breathtaking beauty and profound silence. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the snow draped over the landscape in thick, pristine blankets, sparkling under the sun as if sewn with diamonds. The silence was no longer menacing. It was peaceful, punctuated by the soft whimpers and sleepy sighs of Kyle and Lyra. Now asleep in a makeshift bed by the hearth, Alara knew she couldn't keep them isolated forever. They needed a proper checkup, vaccinations, a professional eye to ensure their ordeal hadn't caused any lasting harm. For the first time in years, she felt a compelling reason to venture back into the world. The thought of driving to the nearby town of Silverwood Creek, of interacting with people, sent a familiar tremor of anxiety through her, but one look at the two sleeping forms pushed it away. Her fear was a ghost. Their need was real. She carefully placed them in a small box lined with her softest blankets and drove her old Jeep down the newly plowed mountain road. The town was nestled in the valley, a quaint collection of wooden storefronts and smoking chimneys. Slowly returning to life after the blizzard, her destination was the small clinic at the end of Main Street Thorne Veterinary Services. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. The clinic was old but meticulously clean, smelling of antiseptic, hay, and a faint, pleasant musk of animals. Bookshelves overflowed with worn medical texts and binders. A portly orange cat slept soundly on the reception counter. A man emerged from a back room. Wiping his hands on a towel, he was in his late 60s. With a kind, weathered face, a shock of unruly white hair, and intelligent blue eyes that crinkled at the corners. This was Dr. Eris Thorne. Well now, Alara. It's been a while, he said, his voice warm and gentle. Didn't expect to see you down from your mountain so soon after that monster of a storm. Is everything all right? I'm fine. Eris, it's not for me, she replied, her voice a little hoarse from disuse. She lifted the box and placed it on the examination table. I found these. Dr. Thorne's kindly expression shifted to one of professional focus. He peered into the box, his eyebrows raising slightly. Good heavens, where did you find them? Near the old oak tree on my property. During the worst of the blizzard, she explained. He gently lifted Kyle, his large, expert hands running over the puppy's small body. He checked his breathing, his temperature, his gums. He did the same for Lyra. He worked in silence for several minutes. His brow furrowed in concentration. They're remarkably healthy. Considering, he murmured, more to himself than to her. A little underweight, but strong. You got to them just in time. He looked up at her, a new respect in his eyes. That was a brave thing to do. Alara, she just nodded, unsure what to say. He turned his attention back to the puppies, who were now awake and looking around with curious, silent alertness. He paused, looking closely at Kale's silver eyes, then at the swirling patterns on Lyra's back. A strange expression crossed his face, a flicker of disbelief. Then dawning wonder, then a shadow of something else. Concern. Eris Alara asked, Is something wrong? He didn't answer immediately. He walked over to a tall, dusty bookshelf in the corner and ran his finger along the spines of several ancient, leather-bound volumes. He selected one, blowing a cloud of dust from its cover before bringing it back to the table. He opened it carefully, its old pages crackling. He flipped through sections filled with elegant, hand-drawn anatomical sketches of animals. He stopped on a specific page. Alara, he said, his voice hushed with awe. I thought this was just a myth, a local legend my grandfather used to tell. He turned the book around for her to see. The page showed a detailed drawing of a dog that looked strikingly similar to a German shepherd, but more slender, more elegant. Its eyes, even in the faded ink, were drawn to look bright and piercing, and down its back was a pattern of swirls and lines that was an almost perfect match to Lyra's. Beneath the drawing, a title was written in ornate script, The Cinderwood Shepherd. They were said to be the original guardians of this valley, Eris explained, his voice low and serious. A breed prized not for aggression, but for their incredible intelligence and a bond with their chosen humans that bordered on telepathic. The stories say they were wiped out over a century ago. A fire, a feud. The details are lost to time. They became a fairy tale. He looked from the drawing to the two puppies on his table, who stared back at him with their luminous silver eyes. Until now. He whispered, I don't know how. I don't know why. But I'm telling you. Alara, these are not just strays. You've found the last two Cinderwood shepherds in the world. The air in the small clinic suddenly felt heavy with the weight of his words. Alara stared at the puppies, her heart pounding. Her world, which she had deliberately made so small and predictable, had just been fractured by an impossible, beautiful, and terrifying legend. The two sparks of life she had rescued from the snow were not just puppies. They were a legacy and a secret. The drive back up the mountain was profoundly different from the journey down. The world outside was the same, the brilliant sun, the sparkling snow, but Alara's perception of it had been irrevocably altered. The weight of the box on the seat beside her was no longer just the weight of two small animals. It was the weight of a century of forgotten history, a living legend entrusted to her by sheer chance. Before she left, Dr. Eris had placed a hand on her arm, his expression grave. Listen to me. Alara, a secret like this is a dangerous thing. There are people in this world who see a creature like this not as a miracle, but as a commodity, a prize to be owned. His eyes held a deep, personal sadness. Let the world believe they are just unusual mutts. Their beauty is now their greatest liability. Keep them safe. Keep them hidden. Alara had promised she would. But Silverwood Creek was a small town, and secrets were its most valuable and most traded. Currency. Despite Eris's discretion, his young assistant had been in the room, her eyes wide with wonder. The girl had mentioned the reclusive painter's silver-eyed miracle puppies to her mother, who mentioned it to her friend at the general store. And from there, the story took on a life of its own. Within 2 days, the legend of the Cinderwood Shepherds, twisted and embellished, had been reborn as intoxicating local gossip. Alara, blissfully unaware in her mountain sanctuary, spent those days fortifying her bond with Kyle and Lyra. They were astonishingly quick learners. They seemed to understand her moods, her soft-spoken commands, her very intent when she worked on her sketches. They lay quietly at her feet. When a wave of sadness washed over her, a phantom from her past, one of them would nudge their head under her hand, their silver eyes looking up at her with what felt uncannily like understanding. The oppressive silence of her cabin had been replaced by a quiet, living warmth. She was happy. The happiness was shattered by the sound of an engine. It was a sound that did not belong. Not the familiar rumble of her own old Jeep or the occasional grumble of the snowplow. This was a deep, powerful purr, the sound of expensive precision engineering. She looked out the window and her heart sank. A sleek, imposing black SUV, its paint gleaming against the pristine snow, was making its way up her long, private driveway. It was an intrusion of black steel and tinted glass into her world of wood and stone. The vehicle stopped, and a man emerged. He was tall, dressed in a tailored cashmere coat that probably cost more than her cabin's entire contents. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his features were handsome in a sharp, predatory way. He moved with an air of effortless superiority, as if the entire mountain was his personal property, and she was merely a temporary tenant. As he approached the porch, Kyle, who had been dozing by the fire, let out a low, guttural growl from deep in his chest. Lyra, silent. stood up and pressed herself against Alara's leg, her small body tense. Alara placed a calming hand on her head, her own senses on high alert. The man stopped at the bottom of her steps, a practiced, charming smile on his face that did not touch his cold. Calculating eyes, "Ms. Alara Vance?" he asked, his voice smooth as polished marble. "My name is Marcus Thorne. Dr. Eris Thorne is my uncle." The name hit Alara like a physical blow. Thorne. A shadow from the bloodline. Eris's warning echoed in her ears. This was it. The danger he had spoken of was standing right in front of her. "What do you want?" Alara asked, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "I'll get straight to the point," Marcus said, his smile unwavering. "My uncle is a sentimental old man, lost in his history books. I, however, am a pragmatist. I am also a passionate collector of rare and unique breeds. Word has reached me that you've stumbled upon something truly extraordinary." His eyes flicked past her, into the cabin, homing in on the two puppies standing guard by her legs. For a fleeting second, the mask of charm dropped, revealing a raw, chilling avarice. It was the look of a man who saw not two living beings, but a priceless set of matching artifacts. "They are beautiful," he breathed, his voice dripping with acquisitive desire. "I am prepared to offer you a sum of money that will ensure you never have to worry about anything for the rest of your life. Name your price. Consider it a finder's fee for returning them to their rightful place." "Their rightful places with me," Alara stated, her voice cold as the winter air. The protective instinct she'd felt in the storm had now solidified into unshakable resolve. She was no longer the timid recluse. She was a guardian. "They are not for sale." Marcus's smile tightened. He let out a short, condescending laugh. "Ms. Vance, please, don't be naive. You're an artist living in a shack. I'm offering you a fortune. You can't possibly provide the security. The specialized care that creatures of their value require, they don't require value care." "Mr. Thorne, they require love. And that's something you clearly know nothing about," she retorted, her gaze unflinching. The last of his feigned politeness evaporated. His eyes narrowed into icy slits. "Everything and everyone has a price," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "I am a very patient man, and I always get what I want. You would do well to remember that." He turned without another word, strode back to his imposing vehicle, and drove away, leaving a trail of dark slush on the perfect white snow. Alara stood on the porch for a long time, her arms wrapped around herself. Kyle and Lyra pressed against her legs. The crisp mountain air now felt heavy with threat. The battle had begun. She had been challenged by a man who saw the world in terms of possessions. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he would not give up easily. The sleek black SUV was gone. But a residue of fear remained, as oily and unwelcome as the tire tracks staining the snow. Marcus Thorne's parting threat echoed in the unnerving silence of the mountains. "I always get what I want." It wasn't a boast, it was a promise. That evening, Alara felt like a stranger in her own home. The familiar creaks and groans of the old cabin, once comforting, now sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold a sinister shape. She did what she could, dragging a heavy bookcase in front of a little-used back door and checking the latches on her windows for the third time. It felt futile, like trying to dam a river with pebbles. But the action settled her nerves, if only slightly. Kale and Lyra mirrored her anxiety. They refused to stray far from her side, their silver eyes constantly scanning the dark windows. They were no longer just puppies, they were sentinels. Sharing a watch they all instinctively knew had begun, exhaustion finally claimed her late into the night. She drifted into a restless sleep in the armchair by the dying fire. A heavy blanket pulled over her, one hand resting on Kyle's back. It was his growl that woke her. It wasn't the sharp, alert bark of a normal dog. It was a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards. She sat bolt upright, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs. Lyra was standing beside her, hackles raised, staring intently at the main window. The cabin was pitch black save for the faint, orange glow of the embers. Elara slid from the chair, her bare feet silent on the cold wood floor. She crept to the window, her breath held tight in her chest, and peered through a small gap in the curtains. At first, she saw nothing but the moon-drenched snow in the dark, skeletal shapes of the trees. Then she saw him, a figure, cloaked in darkness, stood at the edge of her clearing, just within the tree line. It was too far to see his face clearly, but she knew the tall, imposing silhouette. It was Marcus. He wasn't moving towards the house. He was just standing there, watching, observing, a predator sizing up the walls of her enclosure. He raised a hand to his mouth, and a low, two-toned whistle drifted through the night air, a sound designed to entice. To command, Kale's growl deepened, but he did not bark. It was as if he knew that revealing their exact position was a mistake. Nausea churned in Elara's stomach. This wasn't a direct assault. It was psychological warfare. He was testing her, reminding her that he was out there, that her sanctuary was made of nothing but penetrable glass and wood. After a few agonizing minutes that felt like an eternity, he melted back into the shadows of the forest. Sleep was impossible after that. Elara sat wide-eyed until the first gray light of dawn touched the mountain peaks. The puppies pressed against her. The rising sun did not bring relief. Only clarity? She couldn't do this alone. Her isolation, once her greatest shield, was now her greatest weakness. With a desperate, frantic energy, she packed a bag with clothes, her meager savings, and the most important thing she owned, Elias Vance's journal, which Aris had entrusted to her. She bundled the sleepy puppies into their box and fled the cabin as if it were on fire. She didn't know where she was going, only that she was running towards the one person who understood the true nature of the threat. She arrived at Dr. Eris Thorne's clinic just as he was opening up, her face pale and her eyes wide with sleepless fear. He took one look at her and immediately ushered her inside, locking the door behind them. "It's Marcus, isn't it?" he said, his voice grim, through trembling words. She recounted the visit, the cold offer, and the terrifying vigil in the night. Eris listened without interruption, his kind face hardening into a mask of profound regret and resolve. When she finished, he let out a long, weary sigh. "I was afraid of this. I had hoped the taint of my family's past had skipped a generation," he said heavily. He led her past the examination room into his private study, a cozy room lined with books and smelling of old paper and pipe tobacco. He motioned for her to sit, then settled into the worn leather chair behind his desk. "I haven't been entirely honest with you." "Elara," he began, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient shame. "The Thorne family, we were not just enthusiasts of the Cinderwood Shepherds. For generations, we were their sworn protectors. It was a sacred trust. My grandfather was the one who broke it, he looked away, at a faded, sepia-toned photograph on the wall of a proud-looking man with two magnificent dogs at his side. He was a man like Marcus. He saw prestige and wealth, not loyalty and spirit. He tried to sell the remaining breeding pairs to a foreign buyer. The guardian of the line at the time, Elias Vance's own grandfather, tried to stop him. There was a fight. A lantern was knocked over. The fire that the legends speak of, it was real. It destroyed the kennels, and we believed. The entire bloodline. My grandfather's greed extinguished a miracle and brought shame upon our name." Eris's voice was thick with emotion. "I have spent my life trying to atone for that sin. dedicating myself to helping animals, not exploiting them. My nephew, Marcus, he sees these puppies not just as a fortune, but as his birthright, a way to restore the Thorn name not through honor, but through power. He is repeating the sins of his great-grandfather. He leaned forward, his blue eyes locking onto hers, clear and resolute. The shame was gone, replaced by an ironclad determination. "This is not your burden to carry alone," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "It is my family's disgrace, and I will not stand by and watch it happen again. I should have done more than just warn you. From this moment on, your fight is my fight. We will protect them." Together, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made her weep washed over Alara. In the warm, safe confines of the old vet's study, surrounded by books and the quiet wisdom of a good man, a fragile trust had been forged in the crucible of fear. She was no longer a recluse fighting a ghost. She was a guardian with an ally. The alliance with Eris was a balm on Alara's raw nerves, but it also sharpened her focus. For the first time, she was not just reacting to fear, she was part of a strategy. In the sanctuary of his study, with Kyle and Lyra sleeping soundly in a basket by the fire, Eris poured them both a cup of strong, hot tea. "We need to think like a guardian, not like a victim," he said, his voice imbued with a new energy. "Marcus is playing a game of intimidation. We need to play a game of preservation. That starts with understanding everything we can. Tell me again, Alara, exactly where you found them." She described the scene in detail: the howling wind, the towering oak, the small burrow in the snow. It was right at the base of the trunk, on the side sheltered from the wind. It was as if they were placed there. Exactly. Eris's eyes lit up. Placed there. Not abandoned. Elias Vance, the man from the town records. The last of the Guardian line, was an old, experienced woodsman. He knew that storm was coming, if he was caught out in it. He wouldn't have just let the puppies go. He would have done everything in his power to protect the bloodline. He leaned forward, a theory taking shape on his face. He was protecting more than just them. He was protecting their story, a shared understanding passed between them. The answer wasn't in the town's records or in Eris's dusty books. It was up on the mountain, waiting at the scene of the rescue, leaving the puppies in the care of Eris's trusted and tight-lipped wife. They drove back up the mountain in Eris's sturdy truck. Returning to the cabin felt different this time. It wasn't a panicked flight or a grim mission. It was a pilgrimage. The fear was still present, but it was now overlaid with a profound sense of purpose. The sun had been at work for 2 days, and the snow had retreated, revealing patches of damp earth and fallen leaves. They walked to the ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching like old arms towards the sky. The small depression where Alara had found the puppies was still visible, while Alara scanned the area. Ares. Drawing on a knowledge that felt ancestral, knelt by the massive exposed roots of the great tree. He didn't dig randomly. He ran his hands over the twisting wood, feeling its texture, looking for something out of place. His finger stopped on a knob of wood that looked like a natural part of the root. He pressed it with a soft, earthy sigh. A section of turf and packed earth beside the root loosened. His eyes met Ilara's, wide with the discovery. Together. They lifted the section of earth away. Beneath it was a small, hidden cavity, and nestled inside was a satchel made of dark, oiled leather, clearly designed to be weatherproof. It was heavy, solid. The legacy of Elias Vance. They carried it back to the cabin with the reverence of archaeologists, unearthing a sacred tomb. Inside. The air was still and cold, but they lit a fire, and its warmth slowly chased the chill away. They placed the satchel on the large wooden table in the center of the room. Alara's hands trembled slightly as she unbuckled the stiff leather straps. Inside, wrapped in a final layer of oilskin, was a thick, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth with time and use. The pages were filled with a steady, elegant script, chronicling decades of a life lived in service to a secret. It was the last will and testament of the Cinderwood shepherds. They sat for hours, taking turns reading passages aloud, their voices hushed in the quiet cabin. The journal was a treasure trove, a map to the mystery that had consumed them. Elias Vance wrote of the breed's history, confirming Eris's family story with a heartbreaking, first-hand account passed down from his own grandfather. He wrote of their training, their diet, their unique habits. He gave a name to the uncanny connection Alara had felt the Cín Gweled, an old Welsh term meaning shared sight. It was a bond, he explained, that allowed a shepherd and its chosen guardian to communicate through emotion, intent, and eventually, even complex thoughts without a single word. What Alara had felt wasn't her imagination. It was the birth of that bond, but it was the final entry. Dated the morning the great storm began. That made the blood run cold in their veins. Elias's handwriting was slightly rushed, as if he knew his time was short. The signs are here. The sky, the wind. They speak of the great white storm, the one the old tales warned of. I am too old to weather it in the wild. But the lineage must survive. Lyra is due, and I will see the next generation born and secured before the mountain claims me. Yet a darker storm gathers. The Thorn Boy has been asking questions in town, his eyes holding the same greedy fire as his ancestor. The prophecy of the last two is coming to pass. Eris took the book from Alara's hands and read the prophecy himself, his voice a low, somber whisper when the last two sparks of Cinderwood return from the snow. The shadow of the bloodline will rise again. He will seek not to steward, but to chain, to turn loyalty into power and life into gold. A guardian of new blood, who loves them without knowledge of their worth, must rise to shield them. For on their bond will hang the fate of the legacy, whether it is reborn into the light, or extinguished forever in the dark. Silence descended upon the cabin. Thick and heavy, the crackling fire was the only sound. Alara looked at her own hands, then at Eris. The abstract thread of Marcus Thorn had just been forged into the sharp, terrible steel of destiny. The journal wasn't just a history, it was a mandate, the guardian of new blood. The title settled over her, not with the weight of a crown, but with the chilling responsibility of a soldier being handed their shield just as the enemy appears on the horizon. The weight of the prophecy settled over the small cabin, a tangible presence in the firelit air. Alara and Eris spent the rest of the day poring over the journal, absorbing every detail of Elias Vance's life and legacy. They were no longer just protecting two puppies. They were custodians of a history, a sacred trust passed to them by a ghost. Their strategy was simple: disappear. Not by running, but by fading into the background. Ilara would return to her isolated existence, her cabin now a fortress of knowledge. Aris would play the part of the concerned but uninvolved town veterinarian. Keeping his ear to the ground, they agreed that the journal, their most precious asset, should be kept safe, hidden away from the mountain. For now, its secrets were their shield and their sword. But Marcus Thorn was not a man who engaged in honorable combat. He did not lay siege with armies, he poisoned the wells. A week after her pact with Eris, Alara needed to restock her supplies. The thought of going into Silverwood Creek filled her with a new kind of dread. But it was a necessary risk, leaving Kale and Lyra locked safely inside. She drove her jeep down into the valley, her stomach in knots. The change was immediate and chilling. The friendly waves she occasionally received from passing trucks were gone. The cashier at the general store, a woman who had always had a cheerful word about the weather, suddenly couldn't meet her eyes, her movements clipped and efficient. As Ilara walked down the short main street, conversations would lull as she approached, only to resume in hushed whispers the moment she passed. She felt hundreds of eyes on her back. They were no longer the stares of simple curiosity, they were laced with suspicion. She hurried back to her jeep, her heart pounding with a familiar, sickening feeling, the same feeling she'd had when the art world had turned on her. It was the shunning of the herd, the quiet, collective judgment of a community that had made up its mind. That evening, a frantic call from Aris confirmed her fears. "It's Marcus," he said, his voice tight with fury. "He's been investing in the town. A large donation to the school's music program, a new roof for the community hall. He's hosting a dinner for the volunteer fire department next week. He's painting himself as a civic saint, a benefactor, while making me out to be the villain," Ilara finished, the bitter truth settling in. "Exactly," Eris growled. "His people are spreading a story. It's subtle, filled with feigned concern. They talk about the poor, unstable recluse on the mountain who found something she can't possibly handle. About Marcus, the benevolent animal lover, who is only trying to ensure the safety of two priceless animals. He's not attacking you, Ilara. He's rescuing the puppies from you. The true genius of Marcus's plan was its cruelty. He was using her own history, her own deliberate isolation, as the weapon to destroy her credibility. He was turning her shield into her cage. The final phase of his attack came 2 days later. In the form of a county-issued vehicle crunching up her driveway, a portly, officious man in an ill-fitting suit stepped out. Ilara recognized him as Jim Henderson, a local official she'd seen Marcus clapping on the back outside the town diner. "Miss Vance," he said, avoiding her eyes and looking at a clipboard he held like a shield. "I'm from the County Office of Animal Welfare. A formal complaint has been filed expressing serious concern for the well-being of the animals in your possession." A complaint from who, Ilara demanded. Though she knew the answer. Kyle stood beside her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "The complainant is anonymous, as is their right," Henderson said. Taking a step back from the growling puppy, "The report cites your isolated living situation and lack of formal training as potential risks for a breed of such unique and undetermined requirements. They are considered animals of significant local value." He was reciting a script, his voice flat and rehearsed. He held out a folded paper. "This is an official notice. We will be conducting a formal welfare inspection in 3 days' time. An expert, chosen by the county, will assess your home and your suitability as a guardian. If you are found to be unfit, the animals will be remanded into county custody for their own protection and placed where exactly." "With the expert Marcus Thorne paid for," Ilara shot back, her voice shaking with rage. Henderson's face flushed. "This is a standard procedure. Miss Vance, if you obstruct this investigation, we will have a sheriff escort us next time. I suggest you cooperate." He turned and retreated to his car, leaving Ilara standing on her porch with the notice in her hand. The paper felt as cold and heavy as a tombstone. This was the first true betrayal. It wasn't the act of a single enemy, but the complicity of an entire system he had bought and paid for. Marcus wasn't going to break down her door. He was going to have the law do it for him. With a smile and a handshake, he would steal Kyle and Lyra from her with a piece of paper. And the town, the very community she lived in, would stand by and call it justice. The walls were closing in, and she was out of time. The official notice lay on the table like a death warrant. For a few paralyzing moments, Ilara felt the old despair wash over her. The familiar, helpless feeling of being crushed by forces far beyond her control. But then she looked at Kyle and Lyra, who were watching her, their silver eyes wide with shared anxiety. The despair receded, burned away by a clean, hot flame of defiance. She would not let him win. She called Eris, her voice low and urgent. "He's done it. 3 days. Eris, he's sending someone to take them." Eris's voice came back, devoid of all warmth, hardened to steel. Then we have 3 days to make sure there's no one here to find. The inspection is a formality. Ilara, a legal stamp on a theft. We can't fight him in his own arena. We have to leave the board entirely. Run. The word tasted like ash. Run where he's a wealthy man. Aris. There's nowhere he can't reach. Not on the roads, no, Aris said, his voice dropping slightly. But he doesn't have what we have. Look at the journal again. The inside of the back cover. Elias Vance was a guardian. He would have had an escape plan. Ilara grabbed the journal, her hands trembling as she flipped to the back. At first, she saw nothing but aged, yellowed leather, but as she tilted it in the lamplight, she saw it faint lines, etched into the material, almost invisible. It wasn't a map in the traditional sense. It was a sequence of symbols, a trail of breadcrumbs for the worthy, a sketch of a weeping willow by a creek, a carving of a specific constellation, a drawing of 3 jagged peaks she recognized. It was a path through the deep wilderness, a route that would bypass every road and town for 100 miles. The final symbol was a soaring eagle over a sheltered valley, the Soaring Eagle Sanctuary. Eris breathed when she described it to him. It's run by an old friend of mine, a brilliant zoologist named Lena Petrova. It's completely off-grid, fiercely private. If any place is safe from Marcus, it's there. It's our only chance. The decision was made. For 2 days, they prepared. Eris gathered supplies high-energy food, medical kits, water purifiers, while Ilara transformed from an artist into a survivalist. She packed only the essentials into 2 sturdy backpacks, her movements precise and economical. Her paints and canvases were left behind without a second thought. They were relics of a former life, of a woman who no longer existed. Her only art now was the art of survival. She took one last look around the cabin, the place that had been both her prison and her sanctuary. She had come here to hide from the world, and now she was being forced to flee into its wildest heart. It was a bitter irony, with a deep breath. She closed the door on her past and didn't look back. They left on the second night, under the cloak of a new moon. The first leg of the journey was on foot, Ilara's home turf. She led the way through the dense, silent forest, Eris following close behind. The puppies were not a hindrance, they were a gift. They moved with a supernatural silence, their paws making no sound on the thick bed of pine needles. They were her eyes and ears in the darkness. Kale, trotting ahead, would stop and press himself to the ground moments before a nocturnal animal crossed their path. Lyra would nudge Ilara's hand, a silent warning that guided her around a patch of treacherous, loose rock. It was the Singueled, the shared sight. In action, a silent, seamless partnership that left Aris watching in quiet awe. Hours later, they reached their rendezvous point, a long, abandoned logging trail. Eris's old, unassuming truck was hidden in a thicket of trees. The relief of getting off their feet was immense, but the tension only ratcheted higher. Here, on the roads, they were more exposed. They drove for hours through the darkness, using a labyrinth of unpaved back roads and forgotten service lanes. Eris navigating with an old paper map, Ilara watching the shadows. Every pair of headlights in the distance was a potential threat, sending them pulling off the road, dousing the lights, and waiting with held breath until the danger passed. Just before dawn, as they traversed a high mountain pass, they saw it in the valley below. Near the main highway, a series of powerful searchlights cut beams through the darkness, sweeping across the lower slopes of Ilara's mountain. "He knows," she whispered, her blood running cold. "Henderson must have gone to the cabin this morning for a pre-inspection and found us gone. Marcus didn't wait." Eris pressed his foot on the accelerator. All the more reason to get off the grid. Now, they abandoned the truck at a designated trailhead, concealing it as best they could before shouldering their packs and disappearing back into the untamed wilderness. The next phase of their journey was a grueling trek. Following the cryptic symbols from the journal, they waded through icy streams to hide their scent and scrambled over rocky ridges that tore at their clothes and their resolve. Alara, powered by adrenaline and fierce love, felt an endurance she never knew she possessed. Eris, though older, was steady and unflappable. His quiet strength a constant reassurance. Late in the afternoon, exhausted and soaked with sweat, they stumbled into a small, hidden clearing. And there, in the center, stood a single, monolithic slab of granite, etched with ancient patterns. Exactly as the journal had depicted. They were on the right path. They made a cold camp, huddled together for warmth as darkness fell. Too afraid to risk a fire, they were fugitives now, hunted. But as Alara watched Kale and Lyra curl up beside her, their small bodies a source of incredible warmth and comfort, she felt no regret. She had chosen her side. The wilderness was vast and the path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a very long time, she was not running away from something. She was running toward a purpose. After 2 more grueling days of following the journal's cryptic trail, their bodies aching and their spirits frayed, they saw it, nestled in a verdant, hidden valley, shielded on all sides by towering granite cliffs. Was the Soaring Eagle Sanctuary? A high but discreet fence marked its perimeter, and through the trees, they could see grassy pastures and the roofs of well-kept buildings. It was real. It was their haven. As they approached the gate, a tall, strong-looking woman in her late 50s with a long silver braid and sharp, intelligent eyes came out to meet them. A genuine, warm smile spread across her face as she recognized Eris. "My God, I haven't seen you in years," she exclaimed, embracing him warmly before her eyes fell on their ragged appearances. "Good heavens. What happened to you both? You look like you've been through a war. It's a long story." "Lena," Aris said, relief making his voice thick with emotion. "This is Alara Vance. Alara. This is Dr. Lena Petrova, the best and most stubborn zoologist I know." Lena's handshake was firm, her gaze direct and kind. "Anyone who can keep up with this old goat is a friend of mine. Come in, come in. You're safe now." The words, "You're safe now," were the most beautiful sound Alara had ever heard. A wave of profound relief washed over her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. As Lena led them inside the main compound, Alara looked at the sanctuary in awe. It was a paradise. Rescued wolves howled a greeting from a vast, forested enclosure. Rare eagles watched them from enormous aviaries. It was a place built on compassion and respect. Yet, as they walked, Alara felt a subtle tension from the puppies at her feet. They didn't bound ahead or explore curiously. They stayed pressed close to her legs, their silver eyes fixed on Lena, their movements quiet and watchful. Alara dismissed it as exhaustion from their journey. She and Aris were so overwhelmed with relief that they failed to notice the one sign that truly mattered. Lena showed them to a small, comfortable guest cabin, urging them to shower and rest. She brought them hot stew, fresh bread, and clean clothes. It felt like a dream. For the first time in what felt like an eternity. Alara let her guard down. She watched Kyle and Lyra finally relax and fall asleep by the fire, and allowed herself to believe that their nightmare was over. Later, they gathered in the cozy office of the main lodge, sipping mugs of hot herbal tea. The room was filled with books and research papers, a testament to Lena's dedication. "Now," Lena said, her expression gentle. "Tell me everything. Tell me what could possibly drive Eris Thorne to go on the run like some kind of fugitive, trusting his old friend completely." Eris recounted the entire story of the discovery in the snow, the Cinderwood legend, the journal, and the relentless persecution by his nephew. Marcus. He spoke of Marcus's greed and the insidious way he had turned the town against Alara, as he laid the whole desperate story bare. Alara watched Lena's face. She saw the initial shock, the sympathy, but then she saw something else flicker in the woman's eyes, a flash of profound pain, a shadow of guilt so deep it seemed to physically hurt her. When Eris finished, Lena stared into her mug for a long moment. A single tear traced a path down her weathered cheek. "I am so sorry, Eris," she whispered. Her voice choked with a sorrow that Alara didn't understand. Before Eris could ask why, Lena reached under the edge of her large wooden desk. There was a soft, almost inaudible click. Eris suddenly frowned, a look of confusion on his face. He raised a hand to his temple. "Lena, I feel dizzy." He slumped forward in his chair, the mug falling from his hand and shattering on the floor. He was unconscious before it stopped spinning. "Eris," Alara screamed, leaping to her feet, but it was too late. The office door burst open, and two large men in dark security uniforms, men who looked nothing like sanctuary workers, stormed in. One of them grabbed Alara, his grip like iron. Kyle and Lyra were instantly awake, snarling, teeth bared. Placing themselves between Alara and the intruders, Lena stood up, tears streaming freely down her face now, her expression one of utter self-loathing. "I had no choice." "Ilara," she cried, her voice breaking. "He was going to ruin me. This sanctuary, it was all built on his loans. He owns the land, the fences, the buildings. He owns me." The main door to the lodge opened, casting a long shadow into the room. Marcus Thorne stepped inside, immaculately dressed as always, a smile of pure, triumphant evil on his face. He surveyed the scene, Eris unconscious, Alara captured, the puppies cornered with the satisfaction of a master who has just checkmated his opponent. He ignored the humans and walked slowly towards Kale and Lyra, his eyes gleaming with possessive hunger. "Brave. So very brave," he murmured, as if admiring statues. "But loyalty, you see, can be bought, just like everything else." He gave a sharp nod to his men. One of them produced a tranquilizer pistol, the other a reinforced cage. "No!" Alara shrieked, struggling uselessly against the man who held her. "Don't you touch them." Her scream was swallowed by the hiss of the tranquilizer dart. She could only watch in absolute, soul-shattering horror as Kale, then Lyra, succumbed to the drug and went limp. The men caged them with cold, efficient movements. The last thing Alara saw before being dragged away was Marcus running a gloved hand over the bars of the cage, his face alight with a victory so complete, so absolute, that it plunged her entire world into darkness. Hope was a lie. Sanctuary was a trap, and she had led them right into it. Alara awoke to silence, but it was a different kind of silence from the one she knew. It wasn't the organic, living silence of the forest, it was the sterile, humming silence of technology. She was lying on a bed with sheets so white they hurt her eyes, in a room that felt more like a futuristic hospital than a bedroom. The walls were stark white. The furniture was minimalist chrome and black leather, and one entire wall was a sheet of reinforced glass overlooking a perfectly manicured lawn. So green it looked artificial. There were no personal touches, no art, no soul. It was a beautiful, opulent, and utterly soulless cage, her heart hammered with the memory of the betrayal. Aris? Lena's tears. The hiss of the tranquilizer dart. The image of Kale and Lyra, limp and defeated, being locked in a cage. A wave of nausea and despair so profound it was physically painful washed over her. The door slid open with a soft, electronic hiss, and Marcus Thorne entered. He was no longer playing the part of the charming benefactor or the intimidating pursuer. He was now the calm, unquestioned master of his domain. He carried himself with an air of absolute ownership. "Good. You're awake," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I imagine you have questions. Allow me to give you a tour. I find it helps my guest and to understand the full scope of the situation," flanked by two of the same silent guards who had captured her. Alara was led from the room. The estate was a monument to cold, modern wealth. It was less a home than a private museum crossed with a cutting-edge laboratory. Marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting. And priceless, abstract sculptures stood in cold, empty hallways. The tour's destination was a wing of the estate that made Alara's stomach clench. It was a private zoo, but one designed by a monster. Behind thick panes of ballistic glass were a series of sterile, white enclosures. A magnificent snow leopard paced back and forth on a polished concrete floor, its eyes holding a look of maddened boredom. A pair of vibrant macaws sat listlessly on a steel perch, their brilliant feathers looking garish against the clinical white walls. There were no trees, no dirt, no enrichment. It was a collection of living jewels, stripped of their wildness and displayed with all the warmth of pinned butterflies. "I believe in preservation," Marcus said, gesturing to the pathetic displays, "and control. Nature is chaotic, messy. I've improved upon it. Finally." He led her to the heart of his collection, in the largest enclosure, a space equipped with sensors, cameras, and automated feeders. Were Kale and Lyra? The moment they saw Alara, they sprang to life. They hurled themselves at the glass, whining and crying, their paws scratching uselessly at the unbreakable barrier. Their eyes were frantic, filled with a desperate plea that tore Alara's heart to pieces. But when their gaze shifted to Marcus, their desperation instantly hardened into pure, unadulterated hatred. Their lips peeled back from their teeth, and a ferocious, silent snarl contorted their faces. They were no longer puppies, they were wolves, promising death to their captor. A flicker of annoyance crossed Marcus's face. "As you can see, we have a problem. Their attachment to you is inconveniently strong. They refuse to eat. Their stress levels are dangerously high, which compromises the integrity of the samples." "Samples," Alara whispered, a new cold dread creeping over her. Marcus leaned against the glass, looking at the dogs with the dispassionate air of a scientist studying a petri dish. "Did you really think this was about collecting a rare breed? That's a hobby for sentimental fools?" "No, this is about legacy. Not just theirs, but humanity's." He began to pace, his voice filled with the fervor of a true believer. "The Cinderwood Shepherds are a genetic miracle. Alara, the legends of their vitality, their resilience, their unusually long lifespans for a canine breed, they're all true. Their DNA contains a unique protein sequence, a regenerative enzyme that dramatically slows cellular decay. It is, for all intents and purposes, the key to unlocking functional longevity." He stopped and looked at her, his eyes gleaming with obsessive fire. "I am not going to sell dogs. I am going to isolate that enzyme, replicate it, and create the single most valuable pharmaceutical product in history, a true fountain of youth. It will be a revolution, and I will be its king. The fortune it will generate will make nations look poor." Now she understood. It was an evil far greater than she had imagined. He didn't want to own them, he wanted to dissect their very essence, to patent their soul and sell it to the highest bidder. "But they are useless to me like this," he continued, gesturing to the snarling puppies. "My scientists cannot get a clean baseline from such agitated subjects. That's where you come in." He turned to her, his expression shifting to one of cold, logical persuasion. "I am offering you a deal, a partnership. Use your bond, the Singuelid your precious journal speaks of, to calm them. Make them compliant. Cooperate with my research team. In return, I will give you a life you cannot even fathom. Wealth. Security. You can even stay here, as their permanent companion, a gilded cage. Yes, but a cage for three is better than a cage for two, isn't it? He was offering to make her their zookeeper, their Judas. Something inside Alara, something that had been beaten down and broken, finally snapped. All the fear, the despair, the horror, it coalesced into a single, sharp point of pure, defiant rage. She looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze like silver ice. "I would rather die," she said, her voice low and shaking with contempt. "You talk about their loyalty, but you will never understand it because you have none. You can't buy it, you can't steal it, and you can't synthesize it in a lab, and you will never, ever have theirs, or mine, for a moment." Marcus's mask of calm superiority shattered, revealing the furious ego beneath. He had offered her the world, and she had spat in his face. His jaw tightened, and his eyes went cold as a winter tomb. "A pity," he hissed. "Take her back to her room. We will have to find another way to persuade her." As the guards dragged her away, Alara kept her eyes locked on Kyle and Lyra until the door slid shut, separating them once more. She was a prisoner, defeated and alone, but in the barren white room that was her cell. A tiny, defiant spark had been reignited in the ashes of her hope. He had taken everything from her except the one thing he truly wanted, her will, and she would guard it with her life, locked back inside the pristine white room. The force of Alara's defiance faded, leaving behind the crushing weight of reality. The silence descended again, thick and suffocating. She was a prisoner. Eris's fate was unknown. Kyle and Lyra were in the clutches of a monster who wanted to dissect their very souls. She had failed. The despair was a black, icy ocean, and she was sinking into its depths for hours. She lay motionless on the bed, staring at the ceiling, a hollowed-out shell of a woman. The ghosts of her past came to visit the shame of her public humiliation, the ache of her shattered trust, the gnawing loneliness of her self-imposed exile. They whispered to her that this was her destiny, to be betrayed, to be broken, to lose everything she ever cared for. For a time, she believed them. But then, a new image pushed through the gray fog of her misery. It was the memory of two pairs of silver eyes, looking at her not with accusation, but with unwavering trust and love. It was the memory of Kale's low growl as he stood between her and danger, and Lyra's warm head pressing into her hand in silent comfort. Their love was the one thing in her life that had been pure, untainted by ambition or deceit. It was real, and that love became an anchor in the swirling chaos of her despair. Slowly, something began to shift within her. The loneliness that had defined her for 3 years was gone. It had been scoured away and replaced by a fierce, burning connection to two other lives. They were her pack. They were her responsibility. And Marcus Thorne had made the fatal mistake of threatening her pack. The crushing despair did not simply vanish. It began to transmute. The immense energy of her grief and rage began to cool, crystallize, and sharpen into a single, diamond-hard point of purpose. She was their guardian. The prophecy had said so. Her job wasn't over, it had just entered its most dangerous phase. A part of her she thought had died years ago began to stir. It was the Alara before the betrayal, that Alara hadn't been a timid recluse. She had been a fighter. She had navigated the treacherous, shark-infested waters of the competitive art world. She understood composition, structure, and the subtle weaknesses in a presentation. She knew how to observe, how to wait, how to read people and their motivations. The betrayal hadn't destroyed those skills, it had just buried them alive. Now, standing in the rubble of her life, she began to dig them up. Her entire mindset shifted. She was no longer a victim waiting for her fate. She was a predator in a cage. And she began to study the bars, her mind, once a canvas for sorrow, became a catalog of intelligence. Her artist's eye, trained to notice the subtlest shifts in light and shadow, was now a tool for espionage. She began to watch, to listen, to analyze. The guards who brought her meals on a sterile tray became subjects of intense scrutiny. There were 3 of them, working in 8-hour shifts. The day guard was lazy, his movements predictable. The evening guard was nervous, constantly checking his watch. The night guard was the most professional, but he had a habit of humming softly, a sign he believed he was unobserved. The room was no longer a cell, it was a vantage point. She spent hours at the reinforced glass window, not looking at the manicured lawn, but at the patterns of the estate. She noted the sweep and pause of the security cameras, mapping their blind spots. She observed the automated sprinkler system, timing its cycles. She watched the comings and goings of staff vehicles from a distant service entrance. She began to feign compliance. When the guards entered, she was no longer defiant. She was quiet, subdued. With the vacant eyes of a broken spirit, she ate what she was given without complaint. She made her bed. She gave them nothing to watch, nothing to report. She made herself invisible, forgettable. She let them believe they had won, inside. Her mind was a whirlwind. She began to construct a mental blueprint of the fortress, piecing together fragments of information. The low hum she could hear through the wall at night suggested a major utility conduit. The specific angle of a ventilation grate on an outer wall hinted at the layout of the ducts. She was no longer seeing a prison. She was seeing a system, a complex machine designed by a man obsessed with control. And every system had a flaw. Every fortress had a weakness. Her own past, the trauma of having her own life so thoroughly dismantled, gave her a unique and bitter insight. She knew, better than anyone, how a structure that seems impenetrable from the outside can be rotten from within. As she sat in her chair, watching the sunset and paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, an observer would have seen a woman lost to her fate. They would have seen defeat. They were wrong. The wild, chaotic fire of her rage had been banked, controlled, and forged in the crucible of her love for the puppies. It was no longer a wildfire, it was the focused, blue-hot flame of a cutting torch. The victim was gone. The warrior was waiting, in the sterile, white-lit enclosure. Kyle and Lyra were waging their own war. Their world had shrunk to cold floors. The chemical smell of disinfectant, and the impassive glass wall that separated them from everything they loved. Their food, a scientifically balanced paste, sat untouched in its automated dispenser. Water was the only thing they took, and only just enough to survive. It was their one act of defiance, their only weapon against their captor. They could feel the Lara, the Sin Gweled, the shared sight that bound them, was stretched thin and frayed, like a spider's thread in a hurricane. But it hadn't broken. They could feel her fear, her despair, and, most recently, a new, hard spike of determination. She was in this cold, dead place with them, and so they held on. Their resistance was not going unnoticed. In a control room overlooking the enclosure, Marcus Thorne stared at a bank of monitors, his face a mask of cold fury. A scientist in a white lab coat stood beside him, looking nervously at a tablet. Their condition is deteriorating. Mr. Thorne, the scientist said, careful to keep his voice neutral. The stress is causing severe metabolic changes. Every blood and tissue sample is compromised. We can't get a clean baseline. It's as if their own bodies are refusing to cooperate. Make them cooperate, Marcus snapped, not taking his eyes off the puppies, who were huddled together in the far corner, watching him with open hatred. We can't, the scientist countered, swallowing hard. They are actively fighting every sedative. Their physiological resistance is unlike anything I've ever seen. To force the issue would risk system failure. He didn't need to say death. Marcus slammed his hand on the console. All his technology, all his wealth and power, were being defeated by the stubborn will of two small animals. He could cage their bodies, but he couldn't touch their spirit. And their spirit was inextricably linked to the woman he held prisoner in the West Wing. Inside the enclosure, it was Lyra who noticed it first, as the more watchful of the two. Her senses were attuned to the subtle patterns of their prison. There was a low, constant hum that came from a large, grated ventilation shaft high on the wall. She realized that while most sounds died on the hard surfaces of the room, certain frequencies, a sharp, high-pitched whine, a clipped bark seemed to be carried away by the current of air, echoing into the metallic guts of the building. An idea, born of instinct and memory, sparked in her mind. She remembered her first guardian, the kind old man in the forest. She remembered the games he played. They weren't just games, they were lessons. He would hide from them and teach them to listen for his call, a specific rhythm of sounds. A language of love and distance, she nudged Kyle, communicating her intent through the raw, unfiltered channel of their bond. The air speaks. Remember the old man's song, the call and find game. Kyle, ever the pragmatist, was skeptical. The stone walls are deaf. The air is not. Lyra insisted, she is here. I feel her. She will hear us. It was a desperate gamble. An act of pure faith flung into a void of steel and concrete. But it was all they had. They moved to a spot directly beneath the ventilation shaft. Then, together, they began. It wasn't a frenzy of chaotic barking. It was a code. Two sharp, high-pitched yips, followed by a low, mournful whine that held its note for 3 full seconds. A calculated pause of 5 seconds. Then the sequence repeated. Yep. Yep. Woo. The silence. Yep. Yep. Woo. It was the call Elias Vance had taught them. The question he had encoded into their very being. Where are you? We are here. Are you safe? In her room in the West Wing. Alara was on her knees, her face close to the floor, trying to discern the layout of the heating pipes by their faint warmth. Suddenly, she froze, a noise faint, distant but undeniable. It came from the small, metal vent near the ceiling. At first, she dismissed it. The building was full of hums and clicks, but this was different. It had a pattern, driven by a sudden, inexplicable urge. She dragged the minimalist chair over and climbed onto it, pressing her ear against the cold metal of the vent. The sound was clearer here. 2 sharp sounds, then a longer, lower one. A pause. And again, her mind now honed to a razor's edge. Discarded the possibility of it being mechanical. It was organic. It was a call. And it was achingly, heartbreakingly familiar. She closed her eyes. And a passage from the journal she had memorized flashed in her mind. Elias Vance writing about the shepherd's language. The guardian's call is simple but clear. 2 sharp notes to query location. Like a stone skipping twice on water. A long, low note to signal one's own position. The sound of the wind through the pines. A language of sound and silence. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart stopped. Then restarted with a painful, powerful jolt. Yip, yip, whoa. It was them. Tears began to stream down Alara's face. But they were not the tears of despair she had shed before. They were tears of astonishment, of love, of a hope so fierce and sudden it felt like a physical blow. They were alive. They were fighting. They were calling to her, using the secret language of their ancestors, a language she was now the only other soul alive to understand. She was not a prisoner waiting for rescue. She was a guardian who had just received a signal from her pack. The bond was not broken, and through the cold, dark veins of Marcus Thorne's fortress, A lifeline had just been thrown. Dr. Eris Thorne awoke to a pounding headache and the bitter taste of betrayal. He was not in the cozy office of the lodge, but on a simple cot in a small, windowless room. The memory assaulted him in a dizzying rush. Lena's tear-streaked face. The prick of a needle he hadn't even seen. The horrifying realization of his own foolish trust. He surged to his feet, his body trembling with a potent cocktail of rage and adrenaline, and threw himself at the door. It was locked. Solid. He was a prisoner, just like Alara, just like the puppies. Hours later. The lock clicked. The door opened to reveal Lena, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She wasn't a jailer, she was a ghost, haunted by her own actions. She placed a tray with food and water on the small table. Refusing to meet his gaze, "He took them," Eris said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He took the girl and the puppies, and you helped him. He left you," Lena whispered, finally looking at him, her eyes swimming with shame. "He said to keep you here, sedated, until the initial phase was over. He called you a sentimental old man." "Harmless?" She let out a choked, bitter laugh. "He thinks anyone who feels love or loyalty is harmless." She stepped into the room, her movements furtive. "He ruined me. Aris, years ago, a research grant went wrong, and he bailed me out. I didn't know the cost until it was too late. He's been bleeding this sanctuary dry ever since, holding the debt over my head. When you showed up, it was his final price. Deliver the puppies, or he would destroy everything I've built. He would have had all my animals euthanized." Her confession didn't erase the sting of her betrayal, but it painted it in tragic, desperate colors. Eris's fury softened, just slightly, into a vast, weary sorrow. Then, Lena did something unexpected. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a keycard and a small, disposable burner phone. She pressed them into his hand. "The main generator for the perimeter fence undergoes a diagnostic check tonight from 2:00 to 2:15 a.m. The power will be down," she said, her voice barely audible. "There's a service road on the north side that isn't monitored by cameras." "He underestimates us." "Eris? He thinks I'm broken and you're irrelevant." "Prove him wrong, for God's sake." Prove him wrong. It was not forgiveness. It was a desperate, dangerous chance at redemption. That night, under a black, starless sky, Eris slipped out of the sanctuary that had become a prison. He fled into the woods, his heart a painful drum against his ribs. He couldn't go to the police. He couldn't go to any friends. Marcus's influence was too pervasive. He was alone. An old man against a giant. But he had two things Marcus didn't: a lifetime of knowledge and the memory of every word in Elias Vance's journal. He found shelter in an old, abandoned ranger station he knew from his youth. There. He recalled a specific section of the journal, one that spoke of the Circle of the Greenwood, a loose network of conservationists, vets, and rangers that Elias had trusted. The journal hadn't listed names, but it had provided cryptic clues: a specific veterinary journal to place a classified ad in, a passphrase to be used on a particular online forum for wildlife biologists. Using the burner phone's limited data, Aris found the forum. His fingers, clumsy on the tiny screen, typed out the phrase he had memorized: "The Cinderwood sleeps, but does not die," for 2 agonizing days. There was nothing. Then a reply. It was not a message, but a set of GPS coordinates and a time. It was a summons. The coordinates led him to a remote animal rescue center 2 counties over, in a sterile back room, under the hum of fluorescent lights. The circle was waiting. They were not an army. They were 3 people. A woman with a weathered face and the unyielding eyes of a park ranger named Maria. A young, wiry man with a laptop covered in stickers named Ben. who looked more like a hacker than a biologist, and an older, stern-looking veterinarian who introduced himself as Dr. Allport. They looked at Eris with deep skepticism. "We saw your message," Maria said. Her arms crossed. "It's a code we haven't heard in 20 years. Not since Elias Vance passed. Who are you?" With all the passion and gravitas he could muster. Eris laid out the entire story. He told them everything, his voice cracking with emotion as he described the puppies. Alara's bravery, Marcus's soulless ambition, and his own family's ancient sin. He was the living, breathing proof of the Vance prophecy, the penitent heir of the shadow from the bloodline. When he finished, silence hung in the room. Ben was the first to speak, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. "Marcus Thorne." He muttered. "CEO of Thorne Industries, major player in biotech investment. And you've got to be kidding me. He's hosting a massive fundraising gala at his estate in 3 days. The Thorne Gala for Global Conservation." The hypocrisy is staggering. Maria looked at Eris, her skeptical eyes now hard with cold fury. He's flaunting his philanthropy while torturing the last 2 Cinderwood shepherds not on our watch. The circle was small, but their resolve was absolute. They were the last vestiges of the old guard, people who had dedicated their lives to protecting the natural world from the greed of men like Marcus Thorne. "A gala," Dr. Alport said, a slow, strategic smile spreading across his face. "That means hundreds of guests, catering trucks, temporary staff. It means chaos. It's the perfect cover." They huddled around Ben's laptop, which now displayed a satellite image of Marcus's sprawling estate. A plan began to form. A daring, almost impossible scheme born of desperation and righteous anger. They would use the gala. They would infiltrate the fortress. It would be a 2-pronged attack. Maria and Ben would run communications and create a diversion, while Eris and Allport, posing as caterers, would go in. Their mission: find Alara, free the puppies, and expose Marcus Thorne for the monster he was. They were a handful of animal lovers against a billionaire in his fortress. The odds were insane, but as he looked at the determined faces around him, Aris felt a surge of hope. He had found his army. The battle was not yet lost. The night of the Thorne Gala for Global Conservation was an obscene spectacle of wealth. Headlights from a fleet of luxury cars sliced through the darkness, illuminating women in glittering gowns and men in sharp tuxedos. The air, which should have been crisp with the scent of mountain pines, was thick with expensive perfume and the murmur of self-congratulatory chatter. Hidden in the shadows, Aris's small army prepared for war. "You're sure about this, Maria?" "The Ranger?" asked Ben one last time as they sat in a nondescript van parked on a service road overlooking the estate. "The guest Wi-Fi is a joke. A sieve of a network?" "I'm in," Ben confirmed, his face lit by the glow of 3 different screens. "Diversion is ready to launch on your signal." Meanwhile, Eris and Dr. Allport, dressed in ill-fitting white catering jackets, slipped out of the back of a refrigerated truck and blended in with the bustling temporary staff. Their hearts hammered against their ribs, every uniformed guard a potential threat, every curious glance a potential discovery, inside her gilded cage. Ilara knew the moment had come, the distant thrum of music, the increased footfalls in the hallway. The gala was underway. She put her own plan, meticulously crafted in the crucible of her solitude, into motion. When the nervous evening guard brought her final meal, she feigned a violent coughing fit, collapsing to the floor. Startled, the guard rushed to her side, his protocol forgotten in a moment of panic. It was the opening she needed, with a surge of adrenaline. She slammed the heavy meal tray against the back of his head. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. She took his key card and was gone, a ghost slipping into the sterile hallways of the fortress. She wasn't running blind. She was guided by the frantic, silent screams of Coil and Lyra through the Sin Gweled danger. Danger! The cold hand comes and by the perfect mental map she had constructed, just as she reached the main staff corridor. The entire estate shuddered. The smooth jazz music was abruptly cut off, replaced by a deafening emergency klaxon. The lights flickered and died, plunging the hallways into terrifying red emergency lighting from his van. Ben grinned. Showtime. He had done more than just cut the power. He had hijacked every screen on the estate, on the massive projector behind the gala's main stage, on the televisions in the lounges. Images of the caged snow leopard and the listless macaws flashed, interspersed with schematics of the lab that Lena had secretly provided. Over the images, a simple damning text appeared. Welcome to the Thorn Collection, where conservation goes to die. Panic erupted. Guests screamed, running for the exits. Security was thrown into chaos, torn between managing the stampede and figuring out the system breach. It was the perfect diversion. Marcus Thorne, however, was not with his guests. Enraged by the interruption, he was in his gleaming private laboratory. The puppies, already stressed, were now frantic. Forget the gala. The subjects are agitated. We'll lose the baseline, he snarled at his lead scientist. Sedate the male for the spinal extraction. Now, while everyone is distracted, as the terrified scientist approached a whimpering Kale with a long, wicked-looking needle. The laboratory door hissed open. Alara stood there, her face pale but her silver eyes blazing with a warrior's fire. She looked feral, unbreakable. Marcus stared, momentarily stunned into silence. You! He breathed, disbelief warring with fury. It's over. Marcus, Alara said, her voice dangerously calm. She held up the guard's keycard. While your guests are learning about your little zoo, the authorities are getting a full, detailed report on your illegal genetics lab. Your life's work. It was a bluff, but a brilliant one, thrown off balance. Marcus hesitated. That was the moment Coyle, empowered by Alara's presence, made his move. He was not fully sedated. With a savage cry, he launched himself against the side of his enclosure. Not at the glass, but at a conduit hub connecting its power supply. The impact sent a shower of sparks into the air, igniting a cloud of vapor from a nearby chemical tray. A small blue flame erupted. Instantly, the lab's biocontainment protocol kicked in. Red lights flashed furiously. A cold, automated voice echoed through the lab. Chemical fire detected. Halon gas deployment in 60 seconds. Containment doors sealing. The scientists screamed and fled. Aris and Alport, having navigated the chaos, burst through the door just as it began to descend. Alara Aris shouted. The room was a scene from hell. Marcus. His composure finally shattered, made a desperate lunge for Alara, but Aris, with a strength born of righteous fury, tackled him, sending them both sprawling to the floor. Alara didn't hesitate. She ran straight to the enclosure's main control panel, her mind a beacon of clarity in the chaos. She had studied the schematics Lena had provided Aris. Schematics she had visualized for days. She didn't try to open the door. Her hand slammed down on a large, red button labeled Emergency Sterilization Protocol. The effect was instantaneous. A blast of harmless CO2 gas filled the puppy's enclosure. But more importantly, a new alert, one far more serious than a fire, blared through the estate. Warning biohazard breach in Lab 7. Level 4 protocol initiated. External emergency services notified. This is not a drill. It was the one alarm Marcus couldn't override. The one contingency, born of his own paranoia, that automatically contacted federal authorities. It was the trap from which there was no escape. Marcus looked up from the floor, his face a mask of horrified realization. He had been beaten, trapped by his own obsession with control. As the sound of distant sirens grew steadily, unmistakably louder. He let out a roar of pure, defeated rage, ignoring him completely. Alara pressed her hands against the glass of the enclosure. Coil and Lyra, safe from the chaos, rushed to meet her touch. Their desperate whines the most beautiful sound in the world. The storm she had unleashed had finally, gloriously broken. Justice was coming. The sirens were a symphony of justice. As federal agents in hazmat suits stormed the laboratory and local authorities struggled to control the chaos of the gala, Marcus Thorne's empire crumbled in a single, spectacular night. The story became an international sensation. The philanthropic billionaire was exposed as a monster, his name forever synonymous with greed and monstrous cruelty. Led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage, Marcus Thorne finally learned the one lesson his wealth could never teach him. Some things are not for sale. In the ensuing investigation, the full scope of his crimes was laid bare. Lena, her face etched with the pain of her choices, became the prosecution's star witness. Her testimony, filled with remorse and backed by years of coerced records, was damning. In light of her cooperation and the critical role she played in Dr. Eris's escape, she was granted a lenient sentence. The Soaring Eagle Sanctuary was placed under new, ethical management, and she was allowed to stay on. No longer an owner, but a humble caretaker, spending the rest of her days atoning by doing the work she had always loved, the circle of the Greenwood. Their duty done, melted back into the shadows from whence they came, leaving Eris and Alara with a quiet promise of eternal friendship and support. The animals from Marcus's sterile prison were carefully relocated to sanctuaries around the world, where they could finally feel the sun on their fur and the earth beneath their paws. 6 months later, the world looked different. The sky seemed brighter. Alara stood on a gentle, rolling hill, not looking at a canvas, but at a sprawling valley that was now her life's work. The lonely cabin on the mountain was a distant memory, sold to a young family who filled its silence with laughter. In its place was the Vance and Thorne Legacy Sanctuary, funded by a substantial reward from the federal government for their role in dismantling Marcus's criminal enterprise. It was a haven, a promise, a beginning. It was the anti-fortress. Fences were for safety, not for imprisonment. The landscape was wild and natural, with acres of forest, meadows, and a clear, rushing stream. It was a place of healing. Dr. Eris Thorne walked up beside her. His face, once etched with the shame of his family's past, was now filled with a quiet, profound peace. He had spent a lifetime atoning for a sin that wasn't his. And here, he had finally found his absolution. "The new wolf enclosure is finished," he said, a proud smile on his face. "They'll have 3 acres to roam. Maria would be impressed." Alara smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached her bright, silver eyes. The trauma of her past was no longer a ghost that haunted her. It was a scar that had faded, a testament to a battle she had won. She had found her purpose, not in the solitary act of creation, but in the communal act of preservation. She had found a found family, and she was no longer alone. She put 2 fingers to her lips and let out a sharp, clear whistle. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind in the tall grass. Then, from the edge of the woods, 2 figures emerged, running with a fluid grace that was breathtaking to behold. Kyle and Lyra were no longer puppies. They were magnificent young adults, sleek and powerful, their coats shimmering in the sunlight. They bounded towards her, their journey ending as they leaped up, placing their paws gently on her shoulders, their happy whines and licks a joyful chorus. The Singueled was a warm, constant current between them, a silent conversation of love and belonging. She wrapped her arms around them, burying her face in their warm fur. They had come into her life as 2 tiny, desperate sparks in a blizzard, reawakening a part of her she thought was frozen forever. They had led her through fear, betrayal, and darkness, and she had led them into the light. Her life, once a study in solitude, was now a masterpiece of love, loyalty, and purpose. She, Eris, and the last two Cinderwood shepherds were home. Together, the lonely woman who found two puppies in a snowstorm was gone. In her place stood a guardian, a hero, a woman whose life had never been more full.